what we're undertaking at the moment here is a discussion to close up this conference on common interests and common solutions. But we will come back to some of these issues over dinner later on this evening, but maybe not all of you will be at dinner. We'll have some other people joining us at dinner. What we're going to do is have a poll in a minute, which will give you a chance to share your own opinions as to how optimistic you are about being able to find common interests and common solutions. We've had a very broad range of topics we've talked about through yesterday afternoon to this morning, throughout this afternoon. We've talked about security and radicalization. We've talked about trade, new trade and old trade, investment and barriers and so on. We've talked about migration. We've had dinner sessions yesterday evening on pandemics and dealing with cross-border illnesses and so on. We've talked about sustainable development, climate and energy efficiency. It's an enormous range of topics, but ones that confront all countries and that are reflective of the kind of group of people we brought together here for the London Conference from all corners of the world. So the question for this panel is, given the fact we have these challenges that are shared and that they are common interests, can we find common solutions? I thought what we'd do is at least give our panelists, who I will introduce quickly now in reverse order from the far end, former President Cardoso of Brazil, who is now founder of the Fundação Instituto Fernando Henrique Cardoso, who is President of Brazil from 1995 to 2003. We have Anders Fogh Rasmussen, who, as well as being NATO Secretary General for 5 years through to last year, was Prime Minister of Denmark from 2001 to 2009. Closest to me, we have Kevin Rudd, who was both Prime Minister, formerly Foreign Secretary of Australia, and is now President of the Asia Society's Global Policy Institute. And we have Dr. Weira Fieger-Freiberger, who is now President of the Madrid Club, I suppose is how the shorthand one might call it, the World Leadership Alliance Club de Madrid, and was President of Latvia from 1999 to 2007. So we have 4 people, all of whom have been at the top of government, and therefore have experienced what it's like to have to deal with an international system and international institutions. I thought it would be a perfect opportunity there in this particular panel to get their inputs on some big questions as we pull together the panels of earlier on today. So before we do this, you've got your little iPads or whatever it is open here, and we've got a question which is, how do you feel about the prospects of making progress on the global challenges discussed today? And as I can't see the screen, or I might come around and look at the screen, you've got a very simple thing. Could you please press now? When you press on it, it'll give you a set of options about strongly optimistic, optimistic, neutral, pessimistic, or strongly pessimistic. Please press away and choose which one you want. I'm going to think about how good I feel about these things. I'll be a little bit boring and choose something. Oh no, I've given it away. Hopefully, things will come up in a minute. Okay, I want to have a look, so I'm coming around the corner here. Now, it moves around, it refreshes while you're all sending in your messages. How are we doing here? I tell you, this group, despite everything we've done to them today, remain on the optimistic side. My panel can't see it, but just so you know, at the moment, we've got a little over 50% of the respondents saying they feel optimistic. We've got actually quite a split group. We've now got 26% on pessimistic and only about 16% on neutral. So if you take the optimists and the optimists clearly win out not only just the pessimists, but also over the neutral. I was going to say that I was hoping you may make people more optimistic. Now I'm worried that you might leave them more pessimistic at the end of this, because 50% is a pretty strong number given everything we've talked about today. But this reflected, I think, slightly the poll we had earlier on today about whether people believed that a multipolar world could also be multilateral, and we had a strong sense that that would be possible. Well, look, let me move into this session now, and as I said, talk about maybe 3 kinds of topics. I want to go to each of our speakers and ask them, first of all, a question about how much they think the international system is structured in such a way that it allows us to come to common solutions, from the UN through to the regional organizations that have emerged. We heard, I think it's from Shashi Tharoor earlier on today, talking about the fact that you could have networked multilateralism in a way, that individual states could pick and choose around a whole range and array of institutions, in India's case from the G77 to the G20. So maybe the UN isn't so important. But what I'd like to do is maybe starting off with each of you on a big question of this sort. President Cardoso, if I could start with you. And Brazil, a country that has been described an emerging power or a rising power, how does the international system look to you from its governance perspective, from the UN to the regional organizations? Is it capable, do you think, of dealing with the challenges that we've been discussing at this conference today?
Well, good morning. Well, good afternoon, sorry. I'm yet sleeping.
Just flew over, I think.
Well, you know, I think that from the national perspective, no doubt that the international system not just has importance, as the United Nations has been capable, at least, to stop big wars. And this is not a minimal target. It's very important. This was the main motivation for the Organization of the United Nations, was to stop big global wars. So this is positive, no doubts about. On the other hand, it was possible to integrate more people in the same world global system. There is a global order. The last book by Mr. Kissinger was exactly about that, the global order. Is there a real global order? Yes, it exists, a global order. This global order is, of course, uneven. There are some powers much more powerful than others, and being part of an emerging power, Brazil, it's not difficult to see how hard it is for newcomers to participate into the decision-making process. So it's true that it was a step ahead, the Organization of the United Nations, but it's also true that the United Nations is not enough to really allow new powers to emerge with more, trust. And on the other hand, in the last decades, what is very impressive is the fact that there is not only a global order in terms of powers, but also at the beginning of a global society. And from time to time, there is some clash between the order represented by the states, nation states, and the global society, normally represented by non-governmental organizations, NGOs, you see. When the United Nations start proposing a big program, normally the implementation depends heavily not on the bureaucracy of the United Nations or governments, but NGOs. If you remember what happened with the several issues, gender issues, the question of women, environment, racism, all these are very important, issues. The United Nations has been capable to raise the question, to put together different perspectives, but the motor to put the engine working was not inside the United Nations, it came from the global society. And also it depends on different forms, different states perceive the question. So my response would be rather optimistic, with granum salis, some dubious point, because it is okay, but the United States requires now some modification. We can elaborate a little bit later on.
So, key point, stop big wars.
Yeah.
One should not underestimate, obviously, how essential that has been for the gradual evolution, despite violence in all sorts of parts of the world. But the big wars have not recurred. And this interesting idea, I think you said that international institutions, the UN in particular, is kind of mediating aspects of global society, allowing some new institutions to come on to the agenda. Let me just move down the stage. I think it's easiest that way, and turn to Anders, if I may. Come to you to reflect on the same issue. Where would you put the strengths and weaknesses? We've heard, in a way, two strengths to a certain extent of the international order as it currently is visible. You've been head of an institution, NATO, which in some ways, many of its members looked to the UN to give it ultimate authority. In any case, how do you see the structure overall?
Well, no doubt that it was a big and important step forward for mankind that the United Nations was established in the wake of the Second World War. And it has served as a useful framework for consultations and to a certain degree also conflict prevention. Having said that, there are also clearly significant shortcomings. And when it comes to more robust measures to establish peace and to keep peace, it's clear to me that the global system doesn't work. Due to difficulties in force generation, due to slow decision-making processes, due to weak mandates to carry out robust military actions, the global system doesn't work. And this is the reason why, when it comes to security, I think there is much more perspective in strong regional security frameworks. And of course, NATO in that respect, in my opinion, could be considered the gold standard. 28 nations working together, we have managed to maintain peace and stability in the Euro-Atlantic area since the end of the Second World War. Actually, it's the longest period of peace in the history of Europe. Furthermore, we have managed to implement a United Nations mandate in Libya based on the principle of responsibility to protect. NATO allies decided to let NATO carry out that operation according to the UN mandate and include countries from the region. Again, that's an example that on a regional basis you can take sufficiently robust measures when it comes to security. So in short, I don't think the global system works satisfactory when it comes to security. You have to rely on strong regional frameworks.
But let me just come back to you on 2 quick points on this. First of all, could you not say that NATO is the only strong or the only defense or security network that really is worth calling such? So in a way it's sui generis, it's unique, and therefore maybe doesn't serve as a global example. And secondly, you described the fact that it worked on Libya under that UN mandate. Libya came up quite a bit in the discussion of US global leadership yesterday. There was a strong impression, and I'd say there's a strong impression even in the UK, but there was a strong impression, I'd say, amongst this group here, that it was an example of a weak mandate because the members went beyond it in a way in the targeting of Gaddafi, that it went beyond where the UN thought the mandate should have been. And that was a strong impression that emerged yesterday. So there's almost a sense that NATO writes its own rules. So could you just address that issue for a minute? It's the only institution that's out there for security, and if it is, does it end up writing its own rules?
Indeed, and I don't agree that it was a weak mandate. It was a very clear mandate, it was a very robust mandate, and we operated in a full accordance with that mandate. We didn't exceed the mandate. I have to make that very, very clear. I think the weakness when we are speaking about the international community's handling of such situations is that the follow-up didn't exist. The military operation as such was an unprecedented success, an unprecedented precision campaign, and that has been recognized all around. But when we left, no one was there to take over. We were not allowed to have troops on the ground. When the air operation ended, we left on the 31st of October 2011. No one was there to help the new authorities to build and develop a new society. And that's the weakness. And again, I would very much like to see the United Nations play a much, much stronger role. We need the United Nations as a guarantor of international law and right. But it needs more capability to take decisions. Yeah. And here the lesson learned is that one thing is a military operation, but it should be followed by a well-prepared political follow-up strategy.
Okay. Let me keep moving along now to Vara Vika-Freiberger. Where would you come down on this balance of the value of the international systems and institutions we have? I think we've heard their value in stopping big wars, the UN in particular, but it hasn't done a particularly good job at stopping violence or keeping the peace, as Anders Fogh Rasmussen said. Do you think the system works, or does it need some sort of fundamental reform?
There is a tide in the affairs of men that, taken at the flood, leads on to fortune. And the United Nations has not always taken it at the flood. I think that's one of its problems. And the problem is built into its very nature and its foundations. It is a creature of the post-Second World War situation. It was the winners in that war who abrogated to themselves the unique privilege of having permanent seats at the Security Council and looking after the security of the world, because at the time they seemed to be the only ones capable of doing so. Later on, the Security Council was extended with elected members, and the organization as such has shown an impressive degree of flexibility. I remember when I was a child of exiles from Latvia living in Canada, and every time we went to New York, we'd look at the United Nations and look at that row of flags and say, someday, wouldn't it be nice if we could see the flag of Latvia flying among them? And it was just a pipe dream. It was something that we sort of held in our hearts as a sentimental belief in the right of the Latvian people to have their independence, because we'd had it before and fought for it bitterly, and longed for it with all our hearts, and did so for many decades on end. And lo and behold comes the day where, if you drive by the United Nations today, you see the flags of Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, and many other countries that were not there before, who were there represented by that single flag of the USSR, which is no longer there. Thank the Lord for that. And so you see, it's a body also that even during the 8 years that I was president, we would each year would be celebrating the accession of a new country to it. And believe it or not, I had the privilege and the honor of going to the reception given by none other than Switzerland when it finally decided to join the community of nations and to be sufficiently open and engaged to the world. The Security Council has shown its inefficiency. It's shown that it's a ossified structure suffering from serious hardening of the arteries. It's an anachronism. It prevents the United Nations from playing the role that we all would like it to see playing, solving the things that need solving at the global level. The responsibility to protect, for instance, which was accepted, well, not just in those cases where you have, say, China and Russia predictably voting together to block something, or possibly the United States giving a veto to block something. But I sat for 6 years representing Eastern Europe on the Trust Fund for Victims of the Criminal Court. The Criminal Court has taken under its wing 3 Central African countries to help the victims of crimes against humanity, of genocide or war crimes. And you see, there you have these countries where the responsibility to protect that normally we expect from nation states, they were clearly not up to it. And there's a great many places in the world, Syria and elsewhere, Iraq, where Afghanistan and so on and so forth, the state itself is not able to take upon and to carry out the responsibility to protect that in the creation of a nation state citizens would expect from it. That's a serious problem in the world, so we look to the international community. But the international community, of course, is not homogeneous. It is not homogeneous at the United Nations, as I saw when Kofi Annan wanted to carry through serious reforms of it, and blocks of countries were formed, those for reforms, those violently against reforms, those for retarding reforms, and so on. So again, the United Nations was paralyzed in something that truly was an essential task that everybody agreed it should take upon itself. And it was partially done, but only very cautiously and very partially. The multipolar world that so many decry today, or did until a few years ago, what did it mean? It's a sort of reification of a situation, of a temporary situation in the affairs of men, where two great powers have two opposing ideologies, and one has, if you like, universalist, imperialistic tendencies ideologically. The other one wants to have a hegemony politically and economically, and the two come into conflict, and the rest of the world is caught in between, either deliberately stepping out of the fray and saying we're not a part of it, or aligning with one side or another. These are temporary situations. We saw that order collapse, but it was not, I think, a desirable situation. That is not the sort of a world split in two is not the ideal we're looking for. I think when Shashi Tharoor was talking about networks, as well as rule-based societies, I think that I totally agree with Shashi that is what we're looking for in world order, in the international order. And this, by the way, this is not a two-dimensional network. We're talking with a multi-dimensional network extending to infinity, with all sorts of possible connections between countries, elements within countries, issues, problems, foci of interest, and what have you. Multiplicity of ways for countries to cooperate among themselves, and hopefully, of course, to find ways to avoid conflicts, and to avoid conflicts over available natural resources, which I must say, little has been said at this conference, only alluded to, but that will be a crucial, I think, a crucial basis for the future, how the world will settle its way of dividing up the available and necessary natural resources.
And we can come back maybe to that point, because actually somebody else raised that point with me as well earlier. We've talked a bit about islands and so on, but not the resources that might be driving some of the thinking behind it. Thank you very much. Kevin Rudd, let me come to you. We've had a number of points raised here. Stopping big wars, still a continuation of violence, R2P, the responsibility to protect not being met, but still perhaps helping in the UN system smaller states manage conflicts as long as it has the right resources. You're chairing a commission, which I think is underway still at the moment, led by IPI, the International Peace Institute in New York, on what a commission on multilateralism, I think is the right phraseology for it. Therefore, where would you, or where are you and your other commissioners arriving at in your thinking about the strength of this system?
Thanks, Robin. The question I'm most haunted by today, related to the one you've just put, is the one presented to us all this morning by Joe Nye. Joe Nye actually said what worries him most about the future is the tendency towards entropy. I think we should reflect on that carefully, because where I sit, and the Independent Commission on Multilateralism, systematically going through what the UN system does, what I fear most is not any implosion of the system, but what I do fear most is death by 1,000 cuts. You can't sit there and look idly at Syria and say we have a functioning international order. You just can't do that. I mean, this is unspeakable. We now don't speak about it because everyone has acquired learned helplessness about it. If we had a functioning international order, Syria, so close to Europe, would not be where it is today. And it's page 3 now that there are barrel bombs being dropped, etc. 5, 7, 9, 12, and then you go online for the bits up the back. So, as someone said in the previous session on energy and climate change, we're not bad in the international community at looking at how, at predicting what will happen in the near term, but we're absolutely rotten at working out what is happening in the medium to long term. So what I fear is this post-war rules-based system of ours, post-45, cannot be assumed to have a long-term future. It is not naturally self-sustaining. In history, orders are not naturally self-sustaining. Look at the previous ones. The League didn't last for long. The so-called Concert of Europe leaving aside, Franco-Prussian War and the Crimean War and a few other inconvenient truths on the way through. It didn't really last. And then if you're in the developing world, you had centuries of barbarism through colonialism. So order, global order, is actually quite a new thing. And this is not self-sustaining of itself, unless nation-states choose to make it so. So that, for me, is the starting point, which is any institutional arrangement, one which is essential to order, has to be permanently reinvented and reviewed and renewed in order to sustain itself against the challenges of the age. So the question when you look at the current United Nations system, for example, is 4 or 5 quick points. You run around the world today and ask, well, what do you think about the UN? And the first thing people point to is UN Security Council. And they say, here we are in 2015. We have the same 5 permanents as we had in 1945. A few things have changed in the world since then. The baseline question is, why is India not there? Why is Brazil not there? And is this a reflection of global political reality? And unless we take seriously the question of Security Council reform, deep questions of legitimacy are going to permeate beyond intellectual elites. And I think that's one of the dangers we face, to the point where long-term legitimacy of the Security Council and its decisions, right or wrong, good or bad, will start to fade in their global relevance, point one. Point two is, as someone said before stuff gets to the Security Council, how do you stop problems becoming crises, becoming conflicts, becoming collisions, becoming wars? Well, we had that debate in the first decade of the century under Kofi, and we produced something called the Peace Building Commission, which has been monstrously under-resourced and under-empowered since then. But it's there for a good idea. It is there for a good idea, which is, if we were to rehearse the recent history of the Sahel, for example, I mean, so many, using the standard barometers of geopolitical prediction, are reasonably predictive about what's going to happen in a few years' time unless you intervene with X, Y, and Z, A, B, and C. So the reform of the Peacebuilding Commission, not in terms of its mandate, but in terms of its empowerment by the Council, plus its resourcing, and currently it works off the smell of an oily rag, which is not much, is, I think, critical. Thirdly, we have not just legitimacy problems, we have efficiency and effectiveness problems. Look at the ones that have been in the news most recently. FAO. Not FAO, I should say WHO. I'll come on to FAO. WHO, the mandate, clear-cut in terms of global disease. This is no criticism of Margaret Chan. I think she's done a terrific job in an appallingly structured institution over which she has no control, given the role of federal councils within the geographical areas of the FAO. But if Syria says to us the system ain't working vis-a-vis the Security Council, or more broadly the security and political related structures of the UN, then surely Ebola says to us the WHO system ain't working. So unless we take that as a huge warning shot to the system, and as a matter of urgency, which the SG is now seeking to do, turn the WHO structure on its head, then frankly we're guilty of just waving these things through. One final point, and I won't go to the Food and Agricultural Organization, which has been there for 50 years with a mandate to deal with world hunger and hasn't done so well so far. But can I go to this, which is, there are some of these questions which can be fixed within the system, and there are some which can be increasingly addressed outside the system. We've had a session just now, Robin, on climate change, and I'm deeply engaged in that question, Copenhagen Plus, and through to the present. But having been in Copenhagen and seen what's likely to be put on the table at Paris, will it actually concretely add to a reduction in greenhouse gas emissions around the world? And when I ask the question about that and what is binding about the proposed agreement in Paris, the answer is definitive no. So given that the principal emitters are G20 countries, frankly, and you probably get down to about a G10 or a G5, frankly, absence a perfect multilateral agreement, it is high time we use selectively, highly selectively, other mechanisms to broker the final deal, because those countries which are the principal emitters have all of our collective fates in their hands.
Well, what I want to be able to do is to come back later on to some of these selective mechanisms you just described so we can actually get to the how we might make some of these changes. And your point about the UN Security Council leading reform, I'd love to hear some views on reform. But you mentioned something there about the World Health Organization. I'm going to come back to each of you here in a minute with some specific questions. But I want to bring people in. It's late in the afternoon. I want to make sure everyone here is with us. And I can see a lot of hands going up. And in particular, I'm going to call on one person actually who maybe didn't have his hand up, but David Heyman is head of our Center on Global Health Security. We wrote a report, didn't we, on reforming the World Health Organization. So I'm just wondering if you could say something specifically, for example, on how difficult it is to change these types of institutions, what makes it difficult, why hasn't it been done already, but all in 1 or 2 minutes. I mean, quickly, yes? We've got a paper they can read.
Well, it is difficult.
Yeah, it's on.
It is difficult to transform these organizations clearly, but there are also some good things that come from them as they are now. WHO works through treaties, through regulations, through resolutions, and also informally. And it's succeeded in developing, for example, the Framework Convention on Tobacco Control, which has unified the world against smoking. It's developed the international health regulations, which do require countries to develop core capacity in public health, but it's not been followed by most countries. That's a treaty that hasn't succeeded. There's the polio eradication program, which is a collective effort to get rid of a disease, which is based on a simple resolution within the World Health Assembly. And there's the informal Global Outbreak Alert and Response Network, which is a group of over 120 partners within WHO that has successfully until now responded to Ebola and other outbreaks. So there are ways of bypassing the structures but staying within an organization. But granted, the organization would benefit from a change in which its 6 regional committees would respond to a World Health Assembly rather than to regional directors.
Great. So that, just a comment on the health issue. Let me just bring one more on let's see, gentlemen, what he wants here. I'm going to come to others in a minute on more security type things. So if you, yeah.
Thank you. My name is Adama Gaye. I'm from Senegal. Almost 20 years ago, when the Berlin Wall collapsed, there used to be a word very present in all the discourses. That word was democracy. I paid attention to your speeches. None of you mentioned the word democracy. It is something that is no longer relevant in addressing the challenges of the world in which we live, or is it something that, because of the rise of state capitalism, the other form of approach from China and others, that you are shy from mentioning? And I'm raising this as an African because at the moment when people are talking about Africa, I have the feeling that democracy is becoming a tool that is being used by shrewd politicians to not only hijack their countries, but also to engage their countries into deals that ultimately will end up challenging really the sovereignty and independence of most of the African countries. That's one. A second quick question to you, Mr. Rasmussen, about NATO. You said that you operated in Libya under the United Nations mandate. I have the feeling that somehow European nations have been using the international order, either under NATO or in the case of France in Côte d'Ivoire, using the UN to somehow gain competitive advantage against, say, China that has monetary, financial, and other model that is more attractive. And what we saw in the case of Libya, in particular after the victory, reminded me personally of what I call the Fashoda syndrome. In 1898, in Sudan, when Kirchner and Le Marchand met, that's where they decided to divide Africa between the UK and France. In the case of Benghazi, after the victory, it was a symbolic move to see there Mr. Cameron and Mr. Sarkozy going there proclaiming the defeat of Gaddafi. Somehow it is another way of recapturing Africa. Somehow is it not using those institutions against the interests of those countries? I thank you.
What I'm going to do is give a chance to come back just to two of the panelists right now on two of these points, and I will come back to the other two later. Though, if we've recaptured Libya, I'm not quite sure how well the international community has done such a good job on managing that successfully. But democracy, if I could turn first to Vicar Freiberger, because I know your Madrid club puts democracy at the heart of it. We have the Commonwealth based in the UK that does that as well. Could you just say a quick word about democracy? Then I'll turn to Anders Fogh Rasmussen on the other point.
Indeed, I'd be happy to. The Club de Madrid was created 10, 11 years ago after a meeting in Madrid of heads of state and government and former heads of state and government of countries that had in the recent past or within the last few decades made a transition to democracy from autocratic, authoritarian or totalitarian systems. Spain was host because it had had Franco for a great many decades, and many Central and Eastern European countries were represented, Latvia among them, and but also South America and various other places that had had military dictatorships and that had been replaced by electoral processes and leaders who were democratically elected. And not just that, but as the joke goes among us, democratically elected leaders who also know how to pack their bags when their term is up. Because some people seem to have difficulty with that, and once they sit in a chair, they seem to be glued to it.
But are things getting better?
To
Are things
leave
getting
it.
better on the democracy side? I think the question here is,
And what, for
are you
instance,
expanding your membership?
And we are expanding our membership, for which, of course, we can only rejoice, because it was a relatively small group of 30 or so countries that found it, and now we're about 100. And I can assure you that we are not capturing Africa by any means or any other place in the world. But when we go, for instance, myself, having been, say, to Uganda, which is part of Africa, we first consult with the non-governmental organizations on the ground, but at the same time we consult with parliamentarians, with the ministers in power, with the president, with the prime minister. We try to be messengers, if you like, between them, or to bring them together at the same table. We try to encourage the powers that be to carry forth reforms that are considered, I think, universally considered democratic. For instance, in Uganda, a bill in parliament that had a lot of resistance for a very long time, where it was proposed that women should have the right to own property. And one parliamentarian got up and said, we can't do that because a woman who owns property turns into a devil. And we tried to convince him that it wasn't quite so bad, and that if she was a widow, a war widow with 9 children to feed, and had been tilling her land all her life, it didn't seem quite right to just throw her off the land for some distant male relative to take it over, like you have for the English aristocracy in the case of the stately homes that only go to male heirs and that sort of thing, you see?
Right. That threw me where that was finishing up. Let me turn to Libya, though, quickly. Very direct point. Actually, before I could, Anders, could you just hold the thought one more time? I think with President Cardoso here, having seen Brazil go through quite a transition, where do you stand on this point of democracy? It is an interesting point. It's hardly been mentioned today, as a word, actually. Here we are talking about international order, globalization. Are you worried, confident? Here we are with a big, Brazil, big democratic nation, sitting a bit twixt and between, let's call it the West and the rest, in terms of that outlook. Are you optimistic about democracy, worried about it?
Yeah. Well, let me say, just to start, that I was one of the founders of the Club of Madrid. And in effect, I was the first president of the Club of Madrid. And at the time of our first big meeting was about terrorism, because Spain was under attack. So we were concerned with democracy, with the new forms attacking, in order to attack democracy as terrorism. There are no doubts that in some area in the world, democracy is making progress. Take this, the Americas in general, you see? Maybe 20 years ago, we had lots of military regimes, authoritarian regimes, so on and so forth. And today, no one, you see? Well, the last one considered a part of the system was Cuba, and Cuba is now becoming part of the system, in spite of the fact that domestically the chances are a minimum.
But you're not worried about a style of democracy, and be careful my words here, because this is a very representative room, but a style of democracy where elections, in essence, end up being a bit of a sham. There are certain countries in Latin America where this exists, aren't there?
Certainly we have some signals in that sense, and because the network of information is so big nowadays, and the population is so well, I don't know if well, but informed about different issues. And looking after what is going on in terms of how democracy deliver, well, some doubts exist, no doubts about that, you see. But anyhow, there is no trend against democracy. It's a kind of insatisfaction with respect to what is going on under democracy, but it's not a trend against democracy, at least in Latin America, you see. But anyhow, I think this is a crucial point for the world system. But let's also stress the fact that democracy is not, we cannot generalize democracy across the globe, and you cannot aspire, you cannot propose democracy as the only one regime. This will be very controversial and very difficult to take together the different perceptions about how to organize a regime. So what we need is to insist on tolerance. And in spite of the fact that some regimes are different comparing to the classical democratic ones, we have to accept, the diversity. And there is one fundamental aspect, human rights. Human rights is not exactly the same as political regime. And human rights is something with reference to human values in general. So in that sense, considering the human rights as part of democracy, in that sense, democracy has the aspiration to be universal. Not in the sense that every kind of specific political system should be homogeneous. This is probably be impossible.
So it's more focus on the values, perhaps, as you said, than the political systems that we should be focused on. Anders, let me give you a chance to come back on this very specific issue and what else.
Before going to Libya, I would say I'm very pleased that the word democracy has been raised, because I am actually concerned. We were all optimistic after the end of the Cold War, and I think at least I shared Fukuyama's prediction that we were now witnessing the end of history and the last man. But as Kagan later wrote, now we are witnessing the return of history and the end of dreams. According to Freedom House Institution, we have now witnessed for the 9th consecutive year a decline in freedom. We can't take freedom and liberal democracy for granted. And in very concrete terms, I think what we need is what I would call a democratic caucus within the United Nations to strengthen the voice of democracies confronted with this decline in freedoms. Now on Libya, let me make clear that the purpose of NATO's operation in Libya was not regime change. It was the outcome, but it was not the purpose. Actually, you can't remove a dictator from the air. That was the job of the local freedom fighters and their business. What we did was to fully implement the United Nations mandate based on the principle of responsibility to protect. And it was actually a quite robust mandate, because according to Resolution 1973, we were mandated to take all measures to protect the Libyan population against attacks from its own government. We did so. So it was not misused, and I also appreciate that reports, follow-up reports from the United Nations recognize that it was a very successful, unprecedented precision campaign.
Right, let me I've got a lot of people who want to come in and so on, but I did want to just, on the security side and the resilience of it first. Malcolm Rifkin, we've got the advantage of you being here, former Foreign Secretary, so I thought it would be a good idea just to get a viewpoint here on the viability, if you see what I'm saying, especially as a permanent member of the current system. You've heard Kevin Rudd, we'll find out in a minute, find out what he thinks should be done differently, if the Commission is ready or if he's ready to share it. But are you satisfied as a former person who sat in that permanent council that the system is working?
Robin, you began by recording that the majority of this audience are optimists. I'm one of the optimists. I believe that a pessimist is someone who believes that things couldn't be worse. An optimist is someone who knows that they could be. And if we look at the way the world has developed just in the last 25 years, it has actually been incredibly encouraging. The net verdict. We've seen a reduction of nuclear weapons. Over 70,000 at the end of the Cold War, now 22,000 in the world. Still far too many, but a massive reduction. We saw that Cold War itself come to an end without anyone being killed, peacefully, and democracy coming to Eastern Europe and Central Europe without a shot being fired. The European Union, Europe was the place where the two world wars began. And now the European Union, with all its faults, is nevertheless an incredible achievement. And most recently, when the world faced the potential of another 1930s-style economic recession, in fact, such was the cooperation and the emergence of the G20 that we didn't get recession. We actually didn't get for the protectionism that the world lapsed into the last time round. So set against everything else, that's not a bad verdict. Now, coming to the heart of the issue we're discussing at the moment, yes, it is indeed the case that we have this frustrating situation that many countries with common interests can't find common solutions because of their differences. And the single most important example of that at the moment is the Russian-Western relationship. And I'm not going to go into the details of that, that is well known. But what we do know is that despite these fundamental differences between the international community and Russia over Ukraine and its policy and so forth, we have common interests with Russia. The desire to prevent terrorism, the desire to prevent nuclear proliferation, and perhaps most important, as Kevin mentioned, the desire to make progress on Syria. And Russia is a key to that. And we know it's a key to that, this is not some hypothesis. When Russia said we can get rid of chemical weapons in Syria, and the United States said, yes, we can, within 24 hours, Assad agreed. And the vast majority of them have been removed. So the challenge we have got is how do we actually work with Russia, given it's the most important example of this problem, without sacrificing our principles on the areas where there is fundamental difference. And the answer has to be to maximize dialogue in a very specific way. I'm no apologist for Russia. I'm one of that grand légion d'honneur that's actually banned from visiting Moscow for the time being, and that's something that's giving me a great deal of angst. But despite that, I have no doubt that we need to have dialogue with Russia. For example, they shouldn't be expelled from the Council of Europe, regardless of their behavior. They should not have been stopping of the NATO-Russia Council. Far from it. That's exactly the time when the discussions should have been maximized. And I say this not because of any naivety. It's not because dialogue by itself will solve the fundamental problems. They won't solve the problems with Ukraine at this moment in time. What they will do is provide a forum where we can make progress, where we have common interests on non-proliferation, on terrorism, on Syria. And if these forums don't exist, it is infinitely more difficult for the Russians and the West, or the Russians and the international community, to actually find a way of working together, even when they both know that they want to. So that's the point I would make.
Thank you very much, Malcolm. And actually, let me come back to somebody I haven't come back to so far on the panel, Kevin Rudd. Not to comment, if you want, you can, on Russia and so on. But the other big discussion from yesterday evening today, if we're talking about a common interest in solutions at a strategic level, has been China and the US. And here we are, Malcolm Rifkin saying dialogue, area for cooperation needs to be kept open. We've heard from our Chinese speakers here, Wu Jianmin, amongst others. Win-win is what we're looking for. But a lot of criticism that the US somehow isn't going to leave room for China to rise and so on. Are you a pessimist or an optimist on this dynamic of what might be the next 20 years of stability or instability?
I use my words carefully. I'm a small o optimist. But if we look at it in terms of the lens of the last several months, frankly, in terms of the United States and China, we are entering into one of those periods right now off the back of the South China Sea, which reminds me an awful lot of where we got to in the Taiwan Straits in 95, 96. And I see an uncomfortable trajectory ahead for the period. However, that's the immediate. Stand back a bit and look at the longer term. I think the core ingredient to making a global order work in the 21st century is whether the United States and China can agree on one. Whether they can agree on one. When you probe carefully, I've spent about 12 months on this subject at the Harvard Kennedy School last year, looking at China and its impact on the regional and global order, regional meaning Asia Pacific, not here. Then it is very easy to produce a list, Robin, of everything that is going wrong and could go wrong. But if you get beyond the cut and thrust of every day and the tumult of every political discussion and go down to core values, and common interests, once all the smoke settles, there is a sufficient set of core interests and core values between China and the United States which can form the basis of a functioning order for the 21st century. When you look carefully what Xi Jinping has said on this in the last couple of years, and I read his stuff quite carefully, Xi Jinping nowhere, and the Chinese nowhere, say this order has to be thrown out. I've looked for that language. It's not there. And the Chinese are very sensible about this because they've worked out that their own rise has been accommodated by actually the current order. I don't accept the American critique of China freeloading. I think that's a loaded comment and doesn't actually bear direct relationship to the reality in multiple multilateral instruments, including UN peacekeeping, where China's quite a large contributor. But I think if you go to the essence of this China-US relationship, what the Chinese are talking about is, frankly, a question of voice, a question of respect, and the existing institutions, for there to be a larger Chinese voice. They want to see the review and the reform of the current rules-based system, not its absolute replacement. That, I think, is a critical point, and therefore that is where a substantive discussion needs to occur. One final point about where it hasn't. Now, we've had this very sort of heated global debate about the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. I've followed it closely. And there's more heat than light when it comes to that particular debate, in my judgment. Trace it back a bit. I mean, we at the G20 level, years ago, I remember the meeting, wasn't long after the one that Malcolm Rivkin just referred to here in London when we dealt with the financial crisis, the meetings in the several years after that, we all agreed that China's IMF quota should be increased. And then the US Senate blocked it. Now, the Chinese had a look at that, and their conclusion was, this is my judgment, the Chinese would never say this, we said, well, stuff you. We're going to walk around the system. And if you want an example of that, here it comes. It's called the AIIB. So we'll either work with you within the system comprehensively if you give us a greater voice at the table. And while we won't say it directly, if you want an example of how we can walk around the system, here is one. Now, the Chinese officials won't say that. So my core argument in the report I've just issued on this is, with summit-level working leadership between President Obama and Xi Jinping, if they can look beyond the immediacy of South China Sea, look beyond the immediacy of what I describe as the headline issues to, frankly, some deep commonalities about the need to preserve a functioning order for two countries which now have a vast set of global interests, we might get somewhere.
I've got a lot of hands up at the moment. Let me just ask two of the people who are waiting whether they wanted to touch on this issue. Otherwise, I'm going to go in order. Steve, was it on this point or something similar or not? And Michael, are you going into different spaces? Michael Fuller? Somewhat related. One, a different issue or same issue, Michael? Everyone's going to say related. So I'm getting used to that answer. Let me take these two here, and I've got everyone else, I'm pretty certain. Yeah.
Steve Sang, I think I certainly agree with you, Kevin, that the UN system needs changing for it to work effectively. But we also know that it's not going to change in the foreseeable future, and therefore we need a plan B. I think what you said and what Sir Malcolm Rivkin said in terms of how US can work with China and how the West Europe can work with Russia suggests that, in fact, within the existing system, there's much that can actually be done already. But that doesn't actually require any real change in terms of the UN system or any other changes short of a real reform. So in terms of the plan B, from your experience, the distinguished panel, what would be the single most important thing that you want to see change in the way how the UN functions to make it work in a satisfactory way to prevent the kind of situation like Syria from happening?
Okay, we'll get back to that, answer that question later with the panel. Yeah, Michael?
Michael Fullilove. First of all, can I thank the panellists for their very interesting comments, and also thank you, Robin and Chatham House, for a very rich day and a half. I agree with the panel that the liberal international order is now less liberal, less international and less orderly, but I don't think that's because India and Brazil aren't on the Security Council. I think institutions matter and they're important, but the truth is that the post-war order and the institutions that we're talking about were underpinned by US power. And these are hard things to say perhaps in a group like this, but they're underpinned by US power and by the alliance system in Europe and in Asia that kept a lid on interstate friction. And one reason that the post-war order is coming apart and fragmenting is because the US position is weakening and because the US has made bad choices. We've talked a lot about Iraq and President Bush's muscular attempt to change the world, but we haven't talked so much about President Obama's caution, overcautious. To me, Obama has overlearned the lessons from President Bush, and as a result, he has undermined the deterrent effect of US power. The truth is, a lot of bad things don't happen in the world because the bad guys don't know how the United States is going to react to them. So I'm not a complete apologist for the United States, but I think if we're looking for solutions, which I understand is this session's theme, then the US role in the world is still the most important factor. And all of us should be, if we can't vote in the US elections, we should be thinking, what can we do to try to nudge the United States towards a different kind of foreign policy that is prudent and realistic and doesn't make mistakes like Iraq, but at the same time is steelier than the foreign policy that President Obama has run. I know that a lot of people are anxious for the United States to make more room. They relish the idea of a smaller US role in the world, but all I would say to those people is be careful what you wish for.
Okay, I've got a lot of other people waiting to come in, and what I want to do maybe is just see if we keep on this theme of the sort of broader strategic dimension. I want to then come into some very specific examples in the areas of international cooperation, because we've got Paris coming up later on this year. We have the Sustainable Development Goals as well to be covered as this year continues. Actually, 2015 is a pretty important year for cooperation. We've got some very specific issues, for example, on drugs and organized crime that President Cardoso has been involved in. So we've got a lot of specific examples I want to get to in a minute. But let me, if I may, just bring in a couple more broad, which I assume will be fairly broad comments from others who've got their hands up, so I don't miss them at the end. Jeremy, you had your hand up right at the beginning. Microphone coming this way.
Jeremy Greenstock, Chair, UN Association in the UK. To come back to the UN and to follow some other things that have been said, the UN is remarkable for instilling the habit of dialogue between states, more remarkable than any other institution in history, for putting dialogue before you pull the trigger. And even quite difficult states have got used to using that to the best of their ability. But the level of political decision-making has never raised above the level of national capitals. Even though we sit in committees and councils from time to time, for instance in the EU, the level of political decision-making hasn't risen above the national level. There is going to be a Secretary-General election for the UN in 2016, and it's time, surely, for nation-states to think about the role of the UN Secretariat, the non-governmental area of the United Nations, which sits there not just as the forum for dialogue, but as the repository for norms, principles, standards that every global citizen recognizes. There's no other institution that holds those norms ready for everybody to use. Is it time, surely, to have the election of a Secretary General to give him more moral authority, more power with that voice that the UN has in a transparent, open and meritocratic way, which has not happened up to this time.
Thank you. I'm going to be a little unfair because I know somebody I know here who's worked at the UN quite a bit. I mean, a lot of people have here. But Mark, do you mind just stepping in here? I mean, I know you might go a little bit onto, in your current role, you can introduce yourself, but your current role on issues of the Sustainable Development Goals in particular and other issues. But you're also in the thick of it, as they say now in Britain, of the UN system, and you've heard quite a bit of commentary about it here. So thoughts on that if you want, but also thoughts on opportunities for later this year.
Well, thank you, Robin. And I'm Mark Sussman from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, formerly the UN, as Robin said. And maybe one broad observation on the UN and the state of multilateral institutions. It goes back to discussions a little bit about WHO and others. And I think it is clear that existing multilateral institutions struggle to deal with the issues with which they're mandated. That's true in the health space, it's true in the development space, it's true in the security space. The nature of multilateralism, and particularly inclusive multilateralism of UN-type institutions, just tends to be a step behind, and that's both for, personal perspective, political division. You get classic divisions between North and South, the more acute ones that are more political, such as the Russia situation, but it's also a funding and resourcing question. It's interesting when you use the example of WHO that came up again, that people may not be aware that the Gates Foundation is currently the second largest funder of the World Health Organization, cumulatively after the United States, ahead of any other member state, or any member state. We're not a member state. To some degree, that often exposes us to criticism that, what is this unelected independent foundation doing influencing WHO, to which a response I tend to have is that we must be fairly unique among over-influential, that we would love to be less influential. Our vision of success would be that there is far more robust multilateral funding that comes from traditional states, and we're a much smaller portion of that pie. We engage because it's about issues. Polio is one where we're a very major funder. We funded in Ebola, a range of those issues that we'd much rather be part of a much more robust international infrastructure that is leading and driving towards these goals, where we can fit in and provide some niche funding or also things that a foundation like ours could do. And maybe that is a segue into when people were talking about the optimism of the crowd contrasted with a little bit of the pessimism of the discussion, is that an area which Sir Jeremy just alluded to, where the UN does play a very important role, is the setting of norms and values. And arguably one of the greatest successes of the last 10, 15 years has been the Millennium Development Goals. And that was a global goal-setting exercise, which, however one looks at it and whatever success you attribute to multilateral institutions versus the states themselves versus international donors, has definitely led to transformative impact in areas like child mortality, maternal mortality, primary education, and other roles, to the tune of tens of millions of children alive and in school who wouldn't have been if current trends at 2000 had continued. And so it is a pivotal moment, maybe to the panel, as these goals expire, and there are the discussions Robin alluded to coming up at the UN on the Sustainable Development Goals. Before that, there's a financing conference again in Addis Ababa. There's the climate events in Paris. And there does seem to be, there's both an opportunity to drive and build that forward, but a real risk of a dilution of that kind of focus and intensity that the MDGs brought, the financing that came along with it, and just what is the appropriate role of a multilateral setting to drive forward that normative agenda along with the political agendas that have been discussed.
Thank you. I'm going to keep bringing some more points in because I'm worried will be time definitely for our speakers each to include. There was a lady waiting. Yes, there. Thank you. Penn, yeah. And I've got. Yep.
Hi, Suzanne Nossel from Penn American Center. I have a question about Security Council reform, because I think that conversation probably will get restarted in the next few years. I think it has to be. But the question is whether it's time to sort of give up on the original ideal of 70 years ago of a body that really could rise to the most difficult problems of the day, which I think the Security Council has consistently fallen short of doing, and whether to look at a reform council as sort of one among many kind of networked institutions where important countries come together, they discuss, maybe they agree some of the time, but they also reflect the very fundamental differences that exist not only between the largest powers, but even among democracies, and whether it is perhaps by compromising or lowering our expectations of what the Security Council should be, that we can finally get agreement on who should be on it.
If you pass the microphone back, you'll come to you in a second, sir, but Michael Williams, so could you put your hand up, then they'll know where you are. Yep. There was somebody behind. Okay.
Thanks, Robin. I wanted to comment a little.
Just introduce yourself quickly.
Michael Williams, Chatham House, House of Lords, former UN. 20 years ago, I served in the UN in Cambodia and in the former Yugoslavia. Terrible conflicts eventually brought to an end by concerted political and military action by the international community. We are not going to see that, alas, with regard to Syria. Moreover, in those past conflicts, there were international courts and tribunals which still exist and which have brought some of those guilty of terrible violations to justice. Nobody thinks that this is going to happen with regard to Syria, and I would ask the panel to reflect upon that, because it seems to me the entire concept of the responsibility to protect has been broken open by the Syrian conflict. Also, with regard to the International Convention on Refugees, this country, for example, the United Kingdom, 4 years after the Syrian war started, has taken a grand total of 187 refugees, less than 4 a month. I mean, I'm ashamed by that, and it goes contrary to the remarkable record of the United Kingdom over the decades, indeed over the centuries, in ordering refuge to those fleeing persecution. Now, it compares badly with countries like Italy, which took 4,000 in 1 week recently, or Lebanon, which has taken 1.5 million refugees. But the present government gets away with this in clear breach of international human rights standards, and in clear breach, it seems to me, of its responsibilities if we are a permanent member of the Security Council. Thank you.
Thank you. And just the gentleman we were waiting very patiently in the middle there.
Thank you very much. My name is Oliver Sunkel from the Getulio Vargas Foundation in São Paulo. I think this discussion in a way relates to the fundamental question about is current order liberal or not. And I think whenever we go to the United States and we hear global order is easy to join and hard to overturn, I think it's important to keep in mind that there are a lot of countries, and many of them not radical, who simply disagree with that. And I think Brazil is a very interesting example. Mr. President, when you became president of Brazil in 1995, Brazil and India were in very different, similar situations regarding nuclear order. Brazil decided to sign the NPT, became a responsible global citizen. India decided to test nuclear weapons. Now, 20 years later, we see that the United States supports India's bid for UN Security Council. It also accepts India's status as nuclear power, while Brazil, having signed up to the rules, has actually no US support for UN Security Council membership on a permanent basis. Mr. Cardoso's successor, Lula, engaged in the Middle East and tried to sit down on one table with Iran and Turkey. And I remember a CFR report at the time which said that the United States should actively disincentivize Brazil to engage in the Middle East because it was too unpredictable. At the same time, asking Brazil to be a responsible stakeholder, but of course not on its own terms. Lula's successor, Rousseff, then actually proposed her foreign minister the responsibility while protecting as a reaction to the misinterpretation of the mandate in 1973, which did not call for regime change, together with the IPSA countries. And India, Brazil, and South Africa were just basically told off and said, you know, this is big guys' business. You shouldn't worry about how to actually do the bombing stuff, because you don't even have powerful militaries to begin with. So my question is, doesn't all of that point to the fact, from Brazil's perspective, that what really matters is hard power? Accepting the rules doesn't get you anywhere. And this is just the way order works. In that case, global order today is no different from any of the orders we've had over the past centuries. Thank you.
Good question. And I'm about to take this all back to our panel here, who are going to be able to pick up their bits and pieces, and because we've got a good 15 minutes, so exactly 15 minutes. But we're also waiting very patiently from the first round here. Kiko, I've got you, James.
Thank you, Robin. And thank you very much, President Rudd, to really touch upon the empowerment of PBC, because I am the first special ambassador for PBC in Japan. And I just think that the very much 3 points we really have to really think of in order to share common interest. And first one is just very easy, two-handed policy. We need military preparedness and non-military trustworthy relation in order to really not to use the military, that would be better, but we have to have a strong will. If necessary, we have to step in. But at the same time, peacekeeping operation is now very, very good. But peace building operation is very weak. That's why nearly 40% of the conflict at this moment is reoccurred. So I think that empowerment of peace building committee is very important. In order to do so, of course, the Security Council reform is also have to discuss, just like together with Brazil and India, Japan is also thinking about that. The last point is, I just came back from Jordan, visited the camp, and I found out every United Nations and other donator says we have a shortage of the money, so that's why we can't really do that. But we have to think of that we have to empower the 3 different types of refugees. One is refugee in the camp. That is already registered. The second one is in the community. And that causes a lot of problem. And the third one is the FAO is trying to make possible refugees from Syria will not be able to come out, so that they are going to try to introduce agriculture over there. And plus, we have to empower the community, state, nation who accept, like Lebanon, I just, Marcus said that Lebanon and Jordan received 1.4 million refugees. And then the Jordanian young people have no work to do, and very, very difficult situation. Because I always come back to one phrase which 2,000 years ago, the Greek philosopher Aristotle mentioned, that it is more difficult to organize peace than to win the war. But if the peace is not well organized, the fruit of victory will be soon lost. So we should really try to think of something big change. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now, I've got a lot of people still want to come in, but we must finish bang on time at 1:45. And so I was going to give an opportunity to each of our speakers to comment on whatever they'd like to pick up some of these points. Just try and keep it, if you can, to a minute or two, because we are going to take a closing poll to see whether you're more or less optimistic at the end of this. So if I could just be very specific, because I know as well, Anders, you have to go bang on 45. Let me run down actually come back in this order again. Mr. Cardoso first. There were many, many points raised there, but amongst them was the issue of, a key issue that everyone came back to was UN Council reform, in particular the importance of the US role, and R2P, and whether in essence many of the values upon which the UN has been built actually are still credible or not. Responsibility to protect seems to have gone out the window. Where would you stand on some of the points you've heard here? Just one or two of them.
Well, starting with respect to the Security Council. Of course, Security Council is a key element, if you look altogether, the global system. But it's not the only one. It's not the only one. The United Nations also have different branches, very important. Some of them have been referred before. And in some areas have been successful in keeping their objectives, even in difficult areas, for its environment. Anyhow, we have now in December in Paris an attempt to emphasize communalities. So this is the point number one. Point number two, Security Council is specifically important with respect to war and peace. This is the key element for Security Council. Not by chance, some of us have referred to war, others to peace, because we are living in different areas of the world. In my area, the war is not a big problem. Our problem is development, is poverty, is misery. It's a quite different emphasis, you see? Anyhow, of course, a big country like Brazil, we are also concerned with peace in a war, but not directly. We can, maybe even with respect to the Middle East, I think it's possible for Brazilians to think about how can we contribute to some extent to organize the Middle East area. This was an attempt by the Brazilian government. This is a possibility, but it's not the bulk of our preoccupations in Brazil. Our preoccupations are development, democracy, and a better equal kind of social development. That is our question. In that sense, the United Nations have been very important for us, very important, because the idea of Millennium Development Goals, it's very simple but very important, because it allows comparisons, including internally, domestically. For instance, in our case, we create indicators to allow the mayors to compete each other in terms of how good they have been in implementing education, health, or things like that. So this has had an enormous impact in Brazilian society, and this came from the United Nations. Second comment, we have an additional dimension, that is power. We are now, it's obvious that China is becoming a big power, and China will compete with the United States, no doubts about it. So the influence of the United States has to be to accommodate to what's going on in China. Accommodate is not the same as saying, well, have to accept what's going there. No, but you have to dialogue, and this has been emphasized here. I think it's very important. The United Nations has been a big momentum for dialogue, and still, even today, look what is happening in Iran with the nuclear issue. Yeah, they are trying to dialogue, trying to reach an agreement in that so complicated area. We have experience in Brazil with respect to the nuclear, because a long time ago, Brazil and Argentina both were building our bomb, and we have been capable to organize our negotiations, to dialogue each other, and now we have a system of mutual complicity. We can monitorize each other to see to what extent we are enriching our uranium. And that is a very important, very effective result. So I think in the case of, even in this very difficult case like the Iranian crisis, the United Nations is the atmosphere who allows some kind of dialogue. This is very important. This will not prevent national interests, or even that in some circumstances decisions taken by local governments will affect globally the humanity without taking into account what we are trying to do. But anyhow, the fact that it's possible to think about a global order is very important. Finally, in the last decade, the transformation was, everyone knows, profound at the economic level. We are much more integrated. Anyhow, it's impossible to avoid integration because the global market exists, and because the process of production are integrated, you see? So even now, if the Russians are threatening Europe, well, the Germans have to look after Russia because they have gas from Russia, and vice versa. The Russians have also taken into account what's going on in other regions of the world because the world is integrated irrespectively to respect to different kinds of governments in place. There is a more general process who forces us to communicate. We have to take into account others. So I think this is the base for optimism regarding the future. And I must finally say, this is also a novelty. The business is as important as power. To a large extent, business is capable to impose on power. This was not the case in the past. We are no more under imperialism and colonialism when power was so important. States are more important. Now we have a different kind of society. So we have also to take into account all these transformations in order to see what can be done under the umbrella of United Nations and to what extent we can consolidate a new global order.
Thank you very much. And it was, you said, an optimistic view at the end. I know you've got about 1.5 minutes, if I look at my clock down here, which says 43. Anders, and if you need to step up, yes, because then I'll let them finish off down here. So I'll give you a minute.
Some brief remarks. First, what would be the most important reform of the United Nations? No doubt a reform of the Security Council, while it's not the only institution, but still important, reflecting power structures of today. However, I'm not that optimistic about progress because the current permanent members of the Security Council won't dilute their own power. That's why I think a realistic way forward would be a bottom-up process through regional arrangements. I have already mentioned NATO. I think Southeast Asia needs exactly the same multilateral security framework. And let me mention something we haven't discussed in this session, at least, economy and trade. Ideally, global free trade agreements should be concluded within WTO, but progress is very, very slow. So I think, again, a bottom-up process could stimulate such trade agreements, and that's why I think the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and the TTIP, the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, should be concluded as soon as possible. And I think through such regional agreements, you can promote global multilateralism. Finally, I very much agree with the gentleman who suggested more determined American leadership. The fact is that when, or if, the United States retreat and retrench, autocrats, tyrants, and terrorists advance. That's a fact. Or at least they try to test the ground. However, it should be smart American leadership. That is, commitment to multilateralism, outreach to others, including the world's democracies. I would like to see a league of democracies to strengthen the voice of democracy in the world, and outreach to China. And I fully agree with Kevin. The bottom line is that China and the US share interests. And I'm very optimistic about the world order, the future world order in that respect. While there will be competition, while we, of course, should be a bit concerned about some Chinese assertiveness, it is in China's interest to engage in positive, constructive cooperation within the global world order. So I think the future world order will be built on positive, constructive cooperation between the two big powers, China and the United States. And that's a very positive story, actually.
You better go before you see we do the poll. But if you need to go, do step up. But let me give a chance now to Vika Freiberger and then to Kevin Rudd to share their last comments.
I think if we want to have a world order that really works, it should have consequences depending on how member countries of the United Nations, or if you like, member countries of our planet, how they behave. If you do constructive things, then that there should be an intrinsic reward for it, for the country concerned, as well as its neighbors and the rest of the world. And conversely, if rules, international rules, agreements, treaties, memoranda are broken, there should be some consequences that should be unpleasant for the perpetrators. That is not the case at the moment. We heard about the situation of Brazil, which voluntarily gave up nuclear arms and somehow does not feel rewarded for the effort. I think at least Brazil lives in a neighborhood where its neighbors are not threatening to invade it, and the effort and the investment that it didn't put into nuclear power could go to industrial development and to raising the standard of living of its inhabitants. So in that case, living in a good neighborhood has been actually a compensation to not being rewarded internationally. The Ukrainians unfortunately lived in a bad neighborhood, and they gave up nuclear arms and got even guarantees from the powers that that be? The Russian Federation, the United States of America, and Great Britain, where we're sitting this very moment, as nuclear powers who guaranteed their territorial integrity and their sovereignty if they joined the nuclear-free zone in Europe. And look at the rewards that they got for it. Obviously, it was a big mistake on their part to engage in this exercise. So this is a very bad example for the world in terms of being compliant and doing the right thing. I would hope that for the world of the future, more nations will be concerned about actually following the international treaties and ensuring that they're worth more than the paper they're written on. And this applies not just to those who break the treaties, but also to those who guarantee them. I think it's very poor form for those who have assisted and guaranteed a treaty or a memorandum then to step back and wash their hands of the whole thing and say, isn't that too bad? We can't do anything about it. With that kind of attitude, the world is not going to get better. Sorry.
Thank you very much. Kevin, you get the last word. We didn't get to climate change much. You did mention it earlier, which is probably a wise thing to have done, because we're right down to the end now. But I'll let you wrap up, especially on the UN reform issue.
Thanks, Robin, because we're dealing with the central question of global challenges now of such orders of magnitude, such intensity and such rapidity, and the incapacity of our national and international institutions to deal with them effectively and them falling between the cracks. That's the central dilemma that we're discussing, whether you call it leadership or governance or both. One, Michael Fullilove's point about the United States. I think it's a very important cautionary tale. I now live in the United States, and the first time I've done so in my life, the last 18 months. And we should not simply rest on the assumption that the United States will wish to remain permanently globally engaged as a matter of its own domestic politics. There are now two constituencies in the United States which are expressing considerable disinterest in this, or lack of interest, I should say. One, we see them through the Mad Hatters, otherwise called the Tea Party, but they are now having a constituency effect within the Republicans and beyond. And young Americans under 30, ask them whether America should be the global policeman or the upholder of the global order. Increasingly, it attracts a collective shrug. I would simply add that cautionary tale, so we should not simply assume that the United States, for the future, will be permanently politically driven in the direction of being the global power it has been. And so to end that point where Michael left it, if that's not the case, and the answer is a multipolar world, then how do we define it? Because frankly, until we do so, we need to be very careful about simply stepping into a chasm. Number two, my colleague from Senegal's point about democracy. The UN Charter doesn't mandate democracy. It's a society of states, irrespective of their domestic political systems. Our normative framework comes from the Universal Declaration, International Covenant of Civil and Political Rights, and the International Covenant on Social and Economic Rights. For me, the challenge when you deal with the democracy debate around the world, and I'm glad, sir, you've raised it, is the decreasing international self-confidence and national self-confidence of the democracies in themselves and in their political project. And whether it's political dysfunctionalism in Europe and national polities within Europe or within the United States or within elsewhere, it lends to a critique on the part of those who don't share the global democratic project about effectiveness in delivering outcomes. And certainly when I read the Chinese media, which I do all the time, it's a rolling assault on the effectiveness of Western liberal democracy, and post the financial crisis on our capacity to manage a global financial system as well. Third point is Jeremy Greenstock, who I think has left having asked his question. So to you, Jeremy, in absentia, the secretariat function of the UN, he described the role in terms of norm setting, that's been commented on more broadly, and the centrality of international legal frameworks. We will discover what it's like not having them if they disappear out the door backwards. We need to reflect carefully on how far we've come in 70 years. Then you go, however, to the question of functional effectiveness. And I don't think it's an infinite list. We shouldn't have learned collective helplessness about this. To go back to your question, and my Chinese colleague, there are 5 that I would simply focus on. UN Security Council reform in a manner which is doable. The P5 aren't going to give up vetoes. You can have a permanent 5, possibly in addition to them, without a veto power, and it's possible actually to extend that list a little longer while still retaining the current rotational system of elections every 2 years for non-permanent members. But at present, if it is left permanently unaddressed, you will begin to see its legitimacy slide over time. And to that list, I'd then add, as I've said before, the Peace Building Commission, World Health Organization, climate change. We're not going to get an outcome, Robin, in Paris, which is going to either give us a carbon price, which is going to give us a global set of regulations, or anything much else. It's actually going to invite us all to make voluntary national commitments and to honour them, and not even a review mechanism yet as to whether it doesn't add up to an amount equivalent to keeping the temperature increase below 2 degrees centigrade. So let's be honest about that. That's why I default to the big emitters in a G20 context. And then finally, on this year of the Sustainable Development Goals, for God's sake, we must answer this question. Once we agree on the 17 in September, and the worst-kept global secret known to man, once we agree on the 17, who on earth in the global system is responsible for their implementation? Or are we setting up another benchmark for global failure? Is it the United Nations Development Programme? Is it the World Bank? Who is it? Who are we charging? Who are we mandating? My final contribution is simply what Michael Williams raised about refugees, not in a British context, but in a global context. The truth is, the Refugees Convention is one which is crying out for global reform, so we have effective global burden sharing for refugees around the world, with 12 million people in camps and as many beyond camps as internally displaced persons, and before you add the new Syrian numbers. Frankly, this is a global disgrace, and now that it affects the mainstream politics of Europe. So overall, I go back to my initial comment today, Robin, we should be very careful of the UN system not exploding tomorrow, but the death by 1,000 cuts. And I worry about the day when we have slowly morphed into the UN being seen globally as just another global NGO.
Well, now the dangerous thing is to run a poll with that closing comment. But you know, people are so much more optimistic than I expected at the beginning. If you've got your little app there, those of you here, let's see how optimistic we all remain. There's a closing poll option. There was an opening poll. But if you go to the closing poll, how do you feel about the prospects of making progress? Strongly optimistic, optimistic, neutral, pessimistic. It'll be interesting to see where everyone is sitting. And then don't get up, because you've got to do a little bit of homework between now and dinner tonight, for those of you who are coming to dinner. Okay, where have we gone? Where have we gone? Oh dear, yes, that's what I was worried about. Oh no, hold on, let's just wait. The numbers are still coming in. If you haven't pressed submit, submit away, please. We need, Norbert's definitely got to press.
That's probably me.
Yeah. I think maybe people just weren't awake earlier on. We're now at pretty much even 30-30, optimistic and pessimistic. 30-30, with a slightly larger number of undecideds at 27. So 30-30, 30 optimistic, 30 pessimistic, 27 undecided. More where I expected us to start today. We are going to wrap up. I'm not going to try to do a wrap-up either of this panel or of what's preceded it, because I want us to stick with time. We have coaches waiting to take those of you who need a lift to dinner at the British Museum, where drinks start from 7 o'clock. Dinner is then at 7:45 in the wonderful, I think it's called Egyptian Room. Yes, Egyptian Room. Anyways, it's a very nice part of the British Museum. Thanks to Bloomberg this evening for that. But that will be at dinner starting promptly at 7:45, where we will unveil the conclusions of a survey, which, if you've got the time, just underneath polling on your left-hand column of your app is a little thing that says surveys. And if you click on the thing that says surveys, it gives you the option to say what issue. Let me just check the exact question, because I don't want to open it up yet, because I can't fill it out just yet. In any case, there's a survey tab which asks the following question: what issue did you think? Let me have a look. Say, I asked it here. Which theme of the London conference stood out the most? What stood out for you the most? Because we'd like to be able to share that with people at the dinner when you go to dinner tonight. And we will have a little bit of feedback from all of you. So you just you can tweet it in apparently as well, but if you go to your tab and go to surveys, London conference, and then click on that, and you've got a chance to write nothing should be longer than Twitter length. 140 characters for those of you who don't do tweets. So it means short or one sentence of not too many words. And we will then be able to do that and share this evening. Let me say a few words of thanks, because not all of you will be at dinner, though a lot of people of our London crowd have all slipped back to the office and now coming back to dinner with spouses in most cases, or friends or colleagues who've been invited. A big thank you to all of you for being here for this day and a half, those of you who are here, and I'll thank other people later on tonight. Big thank you to our panelists. We could maybe thank the 3 who are here on behalf of all the others who preceded them as well, so a big thank you.